and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Cole, and I'm a Senior Specialist of School Quality and Accountability with the DC Public Charter School Board. Excited to have our third session in the talent series that we are doing in partnership with Ed Plus Consulting and Alicia Robinson. Today, we will specifically be talking about adjusting talent plans in the age of COVID-19. We ask that you all introduce yourself with your name and LEA or organization in the chat. When you utilize the chat, please be sure to select all panelists and all attendees so that everyone can see your response and that we can create a healthy conversation that way. You may also utilize the chat throughout the presentation if you have any questions, as well as the Q&A feature. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. The materials will also be available for you in our distance learning library once the session ends. That's also where you can find all of the sessions that we've been hosting since mid-March on a number of different topics. And with that, I will turn it over to Alicia to introduce our panelists and get the session started.
Well, thank you, Nicole. Hi to everyone for being here today once again. And again, our topic is adjusting talent plans in the age of COVID-19. Excited to be talking about this today. And I feel like there's a lot of kind of very real-time information going on with thinking about our talent priorities and our budgeting and such. I just turned off and didn't fully process the mayor's press conference today about the plans for reopening and such. So we know that this session, we won't come out of it with all of the answers, but what we're hoping to do through this session is help you think about both the adaptive and the technical ways to be thinking, particularly about talent, and how you're thinking about what reopening will look like this fall, this summer/fall. So I'm excited to have our two panelists and Lydia Carlos, who I'll talk about more in just a second too. But let me first introduce our panelists. We have Rhonda Henderson, who, first of all, I have to say that I have bios for all three of these people, and I'm glad that I know them because their bios just don't do any of them enough justice. So I'm going to go off script a little bit in describing all three people that are with us today. But Rhonda is a DC native, and to know Rhonda is to know that. She loves her city, she loves students and just people that are in DC, and is very passionate about doing everything to be supportive of her community. She currently, professionally, is a finance specialist at EdOps that works here in DC and in other parts of the country to help kind of with back office work for school systems, particularly charter school networks. And she is here today to kind of talk some about the kind of technical side of all of this, thinking about the talent priorities and how we think about them in relation to our budgeting and just making it happen in general. As I said, she's a DC native. I must say she's also a graduate of Banneker High School, a proud graduate, I should say. I think you've lived in Ward 4 all your life, or most of your life, something like that, except for when you've been away, at grad school at Harvard or at the Darden School and at UVA and such. So Rhonda just brings a lot of great experience to this conversation today. And our second panelist is Mikaela Seligman, who is currently the executive director at AchieveMission. And AchieveMission has a mission of transforming the leadership and management of social sector organizations to realize deep partnership and achieve mission. They say that they will not rest until we see a social sector filled with equitable organizations developing leadership at all levels. And as I'll keep talking about, of course, it wouldn't be a session with me if we didn't talk about equity. And so, of course, Rhonda and Mikaela both bring a lot of deep insight into thinking about and making sure that we're thinking about inclusive and equitable places. And Mikaela has done that throughout her whole career, many of which she spent here in DC working kind of at the intersection of the social sector, education sector, both as a parent currently of DC public school students, as well as a board member at Mundo Verde Public Charter School, but also serving in the past as a founding charter school leader, a C-suite nonprofit executive, program officer, and coach, and always working with social justice nonprofits and organizations across the country. And I always think of Mikaela in a lot of ways. She is so much more than just this, but I always think of her as this kind of adaptive leadership expert. Whenever I think about adaptive leadership, I think of Mikaela. And that is, I think, partially because it's embedded in what she always does, which is enabling leaders to exercise leadership without formal authority and with the ample resources that they have. And yeah, I could go on about the great engagements and organizations that Mikaela has been a part of, including independent sector, and just working across the board with lots of great social sector organizations. So just know that she has lots of amazing kind of cross-cultural experience and great ability throughout her entire career to really bridge power dynamics and cultural dynamics in the work that she does. So really excited to have both of them here today. But before we dig deeper into the topic, well, to talking to the panelists in particular, once again, we do have the fabulous Dr. Lydia Carless, who is runs her own business, of course, a couple of her own businesses. I think today we're primarily thinking about her business, I Imagine Ed, where she works with schools and education organizations again, sort of at that intersection of equity and all kind of school topics, including issues of early childhood education, which I know a lot of folks are on today that know her from that side of things, but also special education. And to know Lydia too is to know that she is obsessed with equity, particularly racial equity, and making sure that the needs of Black and brown kids are being met in our school systems in particular. She also in her spare time does her, I like to call it her spare professional time, has a photography business too. So she also does a lot of great work around elevating C-suite executives in that way. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Lydia, who's going to start us off with our equiteaser for today. And for those of you who've been with us before, you have gotten a chance to experience the equiteaser, but we'll let Lydia kind of give you a little bit of a background and explanation of how it will work before we also then turn it over to our panelists to give us some thoughts on it too. Go for it, Lydia.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am really happy to be here again and to start things off with another focus on just getting people ready to talk about equity and think about inclusion in the topic. I created equiteasers as a way for groups that sometimes are disparate in either power dynamics or focus of the work to come together and get clear and kind of connected really quickly on what the topic is going to be and the work that has to be done through in a session or in a project. So today we're talking about adaptive leadership, adjusting talent plans in the wake of COVID. So I wanted to focus us in first on inclusion and really thinking about who gets to make those decisions and who is valued and listened to in the decisions about talent. So I'm going to be quiet for about 3 minutes and ask you all to read through the prompt and the questions. And for the folks who are in the, who are participating, it'd be great if you could put your initial responses and thoughts in the chat as we go along. Like, we love to know what you're thinking around these questions. And then for Rhonda and Mikaela, I'm asking them if they could respond to 1 or 2 of the prompts each, and then have the other 1 or 2 to go back and chew on later related to their clients or their schools. And for folks who are on here who don't work specifically with schools, it might be a good idea if you thought about if you're a coach or if you're a consultant, I use these questions with the programs that I'm working with. If you are on a board, as Alicia shared with Mikaela, if you're on a board, you might want to think about, is your school that you're on the board of thinking about these types of questions and asking these kinds of questions of each other and of themselves. So now I'm going to be quiet for 3 minutes, let you all read through the question, and please start chatting it up in the chat. Okay, I would love to start with Mikaela. If you could share your thinking about the prompt and any of the questions.
And if I can jump in real quickly, just before you start, Mikaela, too, as Lydia said before, feel free to be writing comments in the chat with your thoughts too, but make sure the chat is turned to all panelists and attendees as you do write in the chat, just to make sure everyone can see what you're writing. Sorry to interrupt you, Mikaela, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Really good to be here with all of you. Thank you. And I have to say, I think a lot, we'll talk more about this, about leadership as really in a lot of ways asking the right questions. So I love what you shared, Lydia, about the way you think about this with your folks and asking us these questions, like starting off basically with the provocation to say, are we asking the question? So I think the first thing that occurs to me is I love and will definitely steal these questions for various parts of my various roles that I play in my life. And as I look at them, I think what strikes me is a few things. I think my answer, I also have this visual image of your spectrum of active inclusion to shared power. And right, I think when I think about my clients and people that we consult and coach with, few would put themselves in the active exclusion category. I mean, people don't tend to say, we actively exclude people. And yet the systems or the ways we have things set up, or people have things set up, right, end up excluding entire groups of people. And so one of the things that we work on and that I think about particularly, well, it's really in all of these questions, but the kind of who is being included is, and I'll just use an example. So in my board role, I'm in the board of Mundo Verde, a public charter school here in DC, and my children also both attend the school. And I think we do a lot. There are open meetings. We have public comment periods. We have all sorts of opportunities. And we also imagine and assume we do a lot to create a board that is in fact reflective. Like, I'm a parent board member. There are other parent board members. There are parent board members with particular, like, Spanish as a first language, et cetera. But I think when it really gets down to it, I'm not sure the answer. I'd like to go back and say, who is safe to challenge these decisions? How does that work? What happens when? Because I feel like we're somewhere on the, toward the shared power. And I think there are good questions to keep asking ourselves. And I feel like, honestly, that's part of what I'd say with a lot of folks is I think a lot of the organizations I work with have maybe structured ways to do all this, but really, like, how do we know and really listen to particularly marginalized students, staff, and families really deserves continued attention. So I'd say some, more room to sort of improve and strengthen. And I love the provocation of these questions.
Thank you. So we heard a few strategies, like making sure that your parent board members are representative of your school community, having open meetings, having a space for public comments. That's fabulous. And then asking yourself, what more could we be doing is a super important question. Rhonda, what about you and your work with schools and programs? Like, what are you hearing folks doing?
Well, I would say I hear people preparing a budget and then executing against it. And there are usually just a handful of people who make spending decisions, but many people make decisions or questions about how they can spend their money. So if I go back to my experience in the charter schools, I often heard questions from staff who would like to spend the money, but they weren't aware of how the decisions were made to get the budgets that they had. So I would suggest that before there's a question 1, there's a question 0, which is, how do we live out our management of our expenses? Do we talk with our staff about our resources and why our resources are important? Who contributes to thinking about and shaping our resource decisions? Because then when we go into a budget process, people actually feel like this is something I want to participate in and that they will actually contribute to. And so to your question 3, where you ask, how do you know that they are safe to challenge the budget, is that a school leader, and I believe that everyone is a school leader, but some people are designated as the school leader then goes back to that person's suggestion and says, I heard you ask for X. I would like to talk with you about my thoughts on that and how we're going to live this out. And then once the budget is passed, you then will see it lived out on a day-to-day basis. So when a person makes a request for spending, you can say, this is what we agreed on during the budget season, and this is how we're seeing our decision live out in day-to-day life. So I think of budgets as active documents that people should not be afraid of, and that every staff member should have an understanding of that is appropriate to their level of engagement in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So education sounds like first, like making sure that folks understand how decisions are made and what goes into their overall budget. So that would be, and I heard you say staff. So I love to push folks to also think about families, especially in light of COVID-19 and the unprecedented way that that families are having to participate in the education of their children on a day-to-day basis, that it may make a lot more sense. I think it would be good anytime, but especially now when thinking about what our families having to do to be, we always say parents are our children's first teacher. That stuff is real right now in ways that it wasn't before. So how can parents help you think about what needs to be happening in that child's classroom? Because every child is in a different classroom right now and maybe a lot more. So just things to think about. I saw some comments in the chat. Stephanie has a ton of ideas around things that her program is doing. So I would suggest reading through those, and Alicia will share with you how you can save the chat, because there's some great comments in here. I'm gonna turn it back over to Alicia and mute myself.
Thanks so much, Lydia, and to Rhonda and Mikaela too for your thoughts on this. And also, of course, to all of you that wrote in some comments in the chat. I think those are really helpful. And again, as Lydia said, if you open the chat and look near the bottom, you see 3 dots, and you can right-click on that and then save the chat. It saves to your desktop, essentially. So you might want to do that to save thoughts that others are sharing today. But let's dig in. First of all, we've started to kind of throw around some terms. We've thrown around this kind of adaptive leadership piece. And why don't I kind of first think about, is that just some like more new education rhetoric that we're talking about, or what does that really mean in real? How does that live out in reality? So Mikaela, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you can kind of give us some grounding, first of all, in just what adaptive and technical leadership looks like and challenges in general.
All right, thank you, Alicia. Well, I'll try to bring it like super close to home and share a story to start off with, and then I know we have some slides. So you may or may not have noticed, I feel like, of course, it's literally the only thing happening on my screen, but I have kind of a black eye. So I have this like puffy, purpley kind of eye thing going on, and it happened yesterday. And so I was walking out my back gate door, and we lent this kind of old car we have that we don't use much to neighbors during the pandemic who have little kids and were going basically insane, not getting out of the city at all. And we were like, take the car, it's fine. So they parked the car like up against the door, and I went to open the door, and the door went back into my eye. Very painful, bloody, all the rest, right? Didn't have to go to the ER, so that's all good. But I share all that to say where I went, which I think adaptive leadership really starts with kind of this place of inner work. And somebody put up your data, like what data we use to analyze a situation and where that comes from. And one of the first sources of that is inside of our own heads and hearts, is this very like deep set of default reactions. And honestly, at first, I was really angry, and I was like, I can't believe they parked the car there, and now I have a black eye, like I'm gonna have, and I went to all my like, I have a webinar to do, this is, you know, somebody else's fault, I can't believe this happened, blame, 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 second guessing myself, why was I even like going out at that time, like, anyway, all these things, right? I imagine these might be familiar to many of you, probably not the exact situation, but some version of it. So I say all that to say, again, as we come to this that Alicia's shared on the screen here, when we start to look at these definitions, they, again, in any discussion of language, they can occur like concepts, like this adaptive challenge we have. But fundamentally, an adaptive challenge is where there is a gap, like between the values. So who I think of myself as a person and the things I actually do, say, what happens. And there can be a gap there. That's the place where the work can happen. So just, and the second part of this is, you know, that it has to do, again, with, I'll go to this in a little bit, but what we think of as data. So actually being able to step back, not right in that moment when I was, you know, in acute pain, but, and look at the situation and go, huh, what was happening there? Like, where was I going? Where did I go inside? What do I need to do? And then I'll talk about this more, but this idea, as Alicia introduced this, that in most cases, the things we face aren't purely one thing or another. So in that situation, I needed medical advice, right? And somebody could help me who was an expert. That's a more technical response. I needed to get on one of those telemedicine calls, like show them the thing and say, what do I need to do about this? I don't have the expertise to do that. I can't consult with a whole bunch of people and find out what to do about my eye, nor is it a good idea to. But in sourcing beyond that, on relationships I have, on other ways I think of even today, I was like, do I get on the camera? Do I not get on the camera, right? Like all these various things that come out of any specific situation, those are more adaptive work because they relate more to something longer term and deeper in the system. So transitioning out of my particular thing into what many you know, other situations folks might be facing, the adaptive leadership, so you see her here, that kind of center box, is about identifying these collective shifts in values, habits, beliefs, assumptions, ways people have of working that need to shift. We are in a moment in which they already have, right? So one of the things about COVID is, like, we all know, and we talk about this in terms of equity, some of the ways it's surfaced, a lot of the issues that were there prior, these aren't new, but the ways in which we have to think about the solutions to them are different even now. I mean, I know that Rhonda's, like, even the issues of health and safety, and like, just, we always are thinking about the safety of children and communities, but it's in this whole other way now and what that requires. So doing this work kind of takes a very deep listening at the level of individuals. It really goes back, I think, beautifully to what Lydia started us off with. Like, how do we actually listen to the people who have answers with us to the questions that we're facing? Okay, we'll go to the next one. So I talked a little bit about this. It seems so simple to look at this. And of course, you know, you look at this as sort of the bullseye. These aren't, there really aren't white lines between all of these. They're often much more mushed together. But I put this up to say, as an encouragement for you to acknowledge that your feelings and thoughts actually are data. They are things to pay attention to as you lead. I know that Alicia and other friends did one of these prior webinars on sort of wellness and self-care, and people often talk about that as if it's something aside from leadership, right? The fact is, if you can't see and understand kind of where you are, it makes it a whole lot more difficult to deal with other people and really listen to them. So part of this is, do you know that? Are you able to pay attention? And are you able to make connections across? I know many of us right now, some of the national context is incredibly difficult and frustrating. And there it is, right? So we are looking at it, trying to understand it, looking for models of leadership that we may or may not be getting, and have to kind of make sense of the other situations around our teams, what they want and need, and like how we can stay sort of well and keep other people well as we do that. Okay, so you can just keep, yeah, I just got kind of a, so all these little pieces that Alicia just brought up here on the screen of where we are. So this looks very complicated, and we could spend a lot more time on it than we will, but I'll give you really the simple version, and there's also a simplicity to it, actually. On that left axis, right, is disequilibrium, which is essentially stress in a system over time. And the bottom axis there, the horizontal, is that takes time. So a couple things to say. I know Alicia said this in her introduction. You know, doing adaptive work takes time. That's just fundamentally some of what it requires. It also, though, doesn't mean that we're just sort of stuck in a holding pattern, right? It means that action and activity is happening throughout. The thing to pay attention to here, going back to, again, the self-work and the work we're doing in our organizations and communities right now, is where are you in kind of the level of stress and disequilibrium, and where are other people, and do you know that? Because one of the things we want to do when we think about adaptive work, and we think about, again, the inclusion of folks in our communities, is how do we get people in productive ranges of distress? And again, at a moment when we have got levels of unemployment, issues of just fundamental needs being met, you know, I think about, again, some of the technical solutions, but things like the lunch programs and the fact that we've got people, like, those actually do work toward doing adaptive work, right? People have to have solutions to real problems, because otherwise this is a bunch of bunk. Like, people have to be well and be able and eating, and that's where, again, we have to think about then also what's the adaptive work to make sure that's the kind of approach we have and the way we can make sure needs get met, and that people get included in deeper and more strategic kinds of ways as we think about those things. So just given time, I'll leave it at that. I know that you're going to get these slides post session 2, and so you can dig into this a little more.
And so just to clarify too, the adaptive work is just kind of in the middle of it all, essentially. So
adaptive work, yes, thank you. And I realize I'm not sure how much time to take, so give me a cue, Alicia, but is the adaptive work, what I want to say about that is, what we have to do is get people down from the places of just absolute chaos and struggle to be with us. Like, this is that thing about mobilizing attention on the work. And if it's below a certain point, you know, we get that sort of numbness. I mean, we also have, many of us can go into this place like, I just want to binge Netflix for 6 hours, right? Well, sometimes that's just healthy and that's fine. But if that's generally your reaction to the hard work, you kind of need to bring it up a little bit. So it's like some people sort of need to come down, like get stuck in this churning. Some people sort of need to find a way out of whatever, like, I don't know, almost like a denial or a numbing that can happen. Yeah. It can also, in systems, the way this can show up is work avoidance can show up as people getting too hyper-focused on like only the lunch program, again, to the complete missing of like, what's the larger set of learning objectives for our kids this year or whatever. Like, but it means also like getting stuck in sort of a specific problem only and not being able to see the whole thing.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That makes complete sense. And so then even thinking like, does being an adaptive leader then mean ignoring technical details? Like, you know, like technically money is limited, for example, at these times. We got the mayor's budget earlier this week. It was just 1% lower than we were hoping for in terms of student funding increases. It's 3%, which is still really good considering all that's going on in the world. So, but if money is limited and you have to spend more on one thing in light of a pandemic, we can't spend money on another thing. So is that bad?
Well, of course we all want, I mean, I think
from an adaptive
it also reminds me, right, of we're in this place where I think about a lot of the values that are discussed as sort of transformational values as contrasted with white supremacy values, which would be much more a vision of kind of a scarcity, like there isn't enough. But we're in the moment when it feels like, and legitimately, you have to make really hard choices across things. So I think I would say this, if you look at this chart, it's where that centerpiece, most of the kinds of challenges that we're talking about in light of COVID-19, and frankly all the time, are really blended challenges. We may be able to see some of what the problem is, but the answers aren't things we can like pull from somewhere else. We can't say, I mean, there are best practices on many different aspects of the decisions that you might have to make between this or that, but it also requires learning, which goes back to, again, our introduction here today. And the question adaptive leadership would really ask us is, how are you ensuring that that learning is the kind of learning that needs to happen to make the right decisions? It doesn't mean you're not going to have to make tough decisions, and it doesn't mean that you don't have to do the technical work. We have to do work where we use our expertise and apply it to particular problems. Absolutely. But the question is, are we thinking about the larger context and the impact of any one of those decisions, and how are we informing those understandings in a lot of ways?
Gotcha. Okay. And that is kind of leads to the formal versus informal authority considerations then too.
Formal authority is just, this is just an assumption that says, we don't believe, I don't believe, I think we're unfortunately sometimes trained to believe that leadership is someone who has a title. Leadership is exercised. So you can be and have the position, so this formal authority, and not be exercising leadership. And you can be someone who doesn't have the position, who's not the decision maker, and find ways to influence the system so that you are exercising leadership. And that's the dance, right? Of where do we find ourselves and what kinds of roles inside of our systems?
Yeah, it makes me think of Rhonda earlier saying, for example, that all people in a school are leaders. Some just have a formal leadership title, right?
Exactly.
To make those decisions. And even thinking of in the chat, there's some conversation with Lydia and Wendy Edwards right now too about just like Wendy's school is early childhood, and so can you still engage students in decision making when they're so young? There are ways that you can, and ways that are more challenging than if you talk to a high school student, for example. But thinking about getting past that kind of authority as we tend to think of it in a formal capacity to really like, who's maybe the authority on this topic? Wendy mentioned something in the chat about like talking to her students about their playground design. So who's the best authority on what a good playground is in a school? The kids are going to play on it, right? And they don't have the formal authority title, right?
Right.
So that makes sense.
So this one, I mean, I wonder.
And lastly, anything here?
Yeah, I wonder if, one of the things I thought of is how great it would be. I don't know if we give you all 30 seconds. I know it's, those of you who are here on the webinar, to think about and name a current leadership challenge you have. And maybe what we do is actually spend a few minutes just working through, because I think, again, this is much more sort of interesting and useful in the play of it than it is necessarily in just like step 1, 2, 3. And this is not intended to be this kind of thing. So if anyone has top of mind, like, I'm facing this challenge, can you all help me? go for it. You know, put something in the chat.
Yeah, and particularly as you think of like things, and we're going to move into, bring Rhonda into this conversation in just a second too, but even thinking about specific things as you're thinking about your talent budgets and your talent priorities, how you're thinking about your staff and your leaders for next school year. I think I'll go ahead and kind of even move into this slide to bring Rhonda into this conversation a bit. And even as Mikaela said, please feel free to add thoughts in the chat about like where are you personally having challenges in these or other areas, and we can help you kind of think about how to grapple with the adaptive and technical pieces of that. So, so Rhonda, I've been hearing from a lot of school leaders, and again, would love if others in the that are participating here today would go ahead and share in the chat if these are familiar to them or if there are other ones that they would add to this. But everything I'm hearing from school leaders, particularly here in DC, but also in other parts of the country, about what they're thinking about as their talent priorities right now are kind of like salaries for current and prospective staff. Like, are they going to have enough money to give raises for returning staff? Can the offer of salary that they made to a new staff member, can they still honor that amount given some of the changes with funding and just, per pupil funding potentially, but also from funders and such, and just how there's a lot of things up in the air on that. Then this category of things that are kind of like developing staff skill. And that comes, I feel like this is particularly an adaptive challenge because there's so many pieces of that. The automatic thought is very technical to like, do we have enough Chromebooks for every student to do distance learning? And does each teacher have the right equipment to be able to do what they need to do? But, as I'm sure you can talk more about, Rhonda, there's more to that. And then, of course, the health and safety precautions of like, what is it going to really look like? Who do you listen to in some ways about what school needs to look like when it reopens? So first of all, are those similar for you, Rhonda, and what you're hearing from folks? And how would you recommend that, school leaders, CEOs, EDs, finance leaders really tackle these issues?
Yeah, we are hearing those kinds of questions and concerns from our partners and our school leaders. I wanted to make one quick comment about the value of engaging preschoolers or early childhood students in budget decisions. So one example might be around the playground or supplies or snacks. And what the value of that is one, it helps the students to then feel engaged and a part of the larger school community, and they begin to feel like they have a respected voice. And what that then communicates to your staff and to your families is that everybody's voice matters. And I think that is the groundwork of inclusion. And one of the foundational points of equity is saying everybody's voice matters, and I'm going to demonstrate that by even asking a 3-year-old what kind of snacks they like. Would they prefer to have more snacks or more field trips? And when you, again, listen to what they're saying, incorporate their opinions into your decision making, and then later remind them, we decided to do X, you then build buy-in to that decision, and your organization becomes a healthier place to be. And that's really, I think, another foundation of retaining your talent and building a strong community, is acknowledging at the youngest possible level someone's beliefs, and just honoring the fact that they have opinions, they have perspectives, and they want to contribute to that. So I think your budget really reflects your values and your priorities. So as school leaders are thinking about their budgets, the first thing we want to remind ourselves of is that it is a document that just puts a numerical representation to our values and our beliefs. And when you ground yourself in that, it makes it not easier to make decisions, but it does remove a lot of the noise that can creep into a budget, and particularly in an environment where there are a lot of options, bells and whistles, and then also this element of stress. So thinking about that your budget reflects your values can help center and ground what your real priorities are. So then to the nitty gritty
I
of
love that.
actually saying, because when you have these values, talent is at the very top of the list. We see that both reflected when we listen to our school leaders and they rave about their teachers, they rave about how they would like to give them promotions, etc. And then we also see that on a dollar basis. The most money that a school will spend or invest in by percentage will be their staff. So when you're thinking about these things, some things that you might put into play in an area or an environment where your resources aren't as plentiful as you would like. So you might think about delaying hiring for new positions. These are the positions that might be amazing to have, but aren't essential to achieving your mission. So when I think about essential to achieving your mission, I'm not talking just about the nuts and bolts of running a school, the bare minimum. I mean, thinking as broadly as possible and then maybe going, okay, if I can't get my dream, then what is my best possible vision given the resources that I have? And then staffing yourself accordingly. Another practical solution might be to leave a position vacant up until a certain point, and then when it makes sense to hire for that position, to bring somebody on. Then another suggestion might be to make your salary contingent upon your funding. So if you let someone know, I can hire you at this level because this is the funding that I have, but if we get this grant or if our resources look like this sometime in the future, then this is what I can augment to that. Speaking to
Gotcha.
health and safety, jumping ahead a little bit, I think it's important to recognize that everyone is stressed and that teachers and other staff members may feel even more stress or a different type of stress and anxiety than school leaders because they are not in a position directly to control their outcomes. And what I mean by that is teachers know that school leaders are making hiring decisions. They're also making decisions about school staffing, maybe reducing a school staff. And so it's important to kind of put yourself into the mindset of how will my teaching staff feel about this decision? They're probably going to feel more anxious than I do, or a different kind of anxiety than I do. So when you're thinking about their health and wellness, you might ask them, what are your biggest needs right now? What is it that is truly stressing you out about coming to work? And it just might happen that you can meet their need. So I worked with a school leader who asked her staff that question, and they proposed an answer that she was able to provide. And that's a win-win for everybody because she loves her staff and she wants to invest in them. The staff want to do their best work, but they are also stressed. And so she took that risk in a way because you don't know what people will say to meet their needs, but it turned out to be something that they could provide for them. And they were really happy about that. Something unusual that we will have to plan for in terms of budgeting this year that we haven't in the past, personal protective safety gear. So the PPE that we'll need to have, we don't know exactly what that looks like, but you'll want to budget for that. You'll also want to think about how will you make your school environment even safer for your staff to come in from a health perspective. Remember how we adapted our school system and our school buildings to respond to threats of outside violence? Well, we're responding in a different way now, and it's to the threat of a health crisis. So that gives me the confidence that we'll be able to pivot and make these adjustments, but these will be elements that you'll put into your budget. And then the last piece about health and safety is that this health crisis has made that much more valuable the contingency budget, the what if, because there's no one who would have predicted that this would happen last fall when we started the school year. We would not have said, oh, in the spring, we're actually going to transition to distance learning, and it's probably going to cost us anywhere between $10,000 and $25,000, depending on your school size. So this, the public health crisis has really doubled down on the importance of having a contingency fund. And one of the reasons that we were able to, what the mayor said that we're able to increase per pupil funding at 3% is because of the rainy day fund. So as we're talking about budgets, we want to think about FY21, but we also want to think about 22 and 23 because that area is even more uncertain. So I'll stop there.
Yeah.
So that we can continue to talk about this in a few different ways.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I want to ask a quick question of just like what you've seen as some maybe best practices, or what advice you just have on the how of some of this. Like if you're thinking about engaging teachers, families, and students even in some of this thinking. Yeah, for example, on one of our webinars a couple of weeks ago, we talked about just doing staff check-ins, like even a quick survey that's like, how are you feeling about how are you just feeling right now in general? So I could imagine like surveying staff might be a good way, but obviously right now, because we're in the distance situation, we can't just have a staff meeting or have a parent meeting in person. So do you have any other thoughts about how to engage people in the discussion
Yeah, I would say
of all these topics?
one is to be very clear about what you are thinking about and what is up for discussion and what is not up for discussion, and sharing the difference between the two. My parents are coming back to mind, actually, because everyone will have an opinion about something, but in certain cases, your opinion will influence the outcome, and in other cases, it will not influence the outcome. Staff are engaged in the life of their school, and we are also very smart, and so we can pick up on when you are sincerely soliciting our opinion and when you're just checking a box. So first, be very clear about what you are actually, what is up for discussion and what is not, and what you've already decided, and then bring that to your staff. So if the question is, I am thinking about our professional development budget, this is the amount that we have, these are the people who we have brought in the past, who do you recommend that we bring back, for how many days, how would you spend these resources? And that way, your staff, again, participates in collective decision-making, so that when you make that decision, you actually live it out. They recognize that as something that they agree to. And if it's a tight decision in particular, if you've had to make some difficult trade-offs, they, again, are more willing to live that out, because they've already been part of the decision-making. So that's one of the first things I would do that. And then in terms of communication.
Oh, go ahead.
So, because we're all virtual now, I think that we really have to go back to some of the tried and true strategies of actually picking up the phone and talking with individuals, because it is so easy to feel disconnected if you are just, if you start with just email, or if you start with a large webinar, but don't follow up with that one-off conversation that said, hey, I think that you had a different perspective on this particular decision. Can you tell me what it is that you're thinking? How can I understand you better? Because again, at some point down the line, that decision is going to be part of someone's real experience. And as they live out that experience, you want them to feel confident, or at least okay with what happened. And that, again, I see is a strong talent retention strategy, because you are constantly bringing people into the conversation and helping them to feel connected at a time where we're very anxious and we feel very disconnected to decisions. You can imagine that at some point, is going to get an email that says, this is your job, this is your offer. We want that to feel personal. And you can make that feel personal by actually just picking up the phone and having an honest and open conversation about how their voice fits into the larger decision-making process.
Sure. And I've even heard people say things like, would you feel more comfortable doing this by Zoom or by phone, having this conversation? Like, different people have different comfort levels there, or it just might be easier to do this while they're going for a walk or something like that. So important things to think about. And I think this is a good segue into this next part that I'd love for both Rhonda and Mikaela to kind of share your thoughts on. Just as we think about all of these decisions and topics, there's a lot of needing to take care of people that should be part of this. I've posted today, a friend, Carmita Simon, wrote a great article. She's with the Surge Institute, and just a great article as a leader of an organization about putting people first in these decisions that we're making right now, and making sure we're acknowledging that people are people outside of this. And this slide shows some things that Franklin Covey points out are important to kind of taking care of people. But I'd love to hear from both of you what your thoughts are on, like, as organizations make some budget shifts, like are making some tough decisions in some cases, whether it might be anything as difficult as difficult as like furloughing staff, to like something like your salary, we're not sure if we can tell you yet if your salary is getting increased, or just that we might need to cut back on this curriculum program or this coaching piece or something as part of our cutting money. How do you really like take care of people and honor their feelings and their personhood as you go through these processes?
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind as you were saying that, Alicia, is that when you when you present the problem, you also invite conversation for a solution. So if you're suggesting that we are going to have to cut back on our professional development, but that teacher still knows I still have to grow, then the next question is, what else can we do? How can we generate a collaborative solution? And give them the information that you're working with. If you're saying our budget last year, let's just throw out a number, our budget last year was $50,000 for professional development. We're choosing to reduce that by 10% or 20% because we want to extend more money to families. Now we have this new number, we're working with $35,000 or $40,000. How can we still meet our needs with this new resource? And you can see the trade-offs that we're making. That gives someone a very concrete problem to solve instead of walking away thinking, well, geez, I don't know how I'm going to grow as a teacher, even though I want to improve my practice so that I can continue my professional development. So I would encourage school leaders to be very specific as much as possible in the decisions that they're having to make, and then invite people to have very specific solutions. And you will be very surprised at how creative individuals, maybe you won't be surprised at their creativity because educators are incredibly creative, but when you give them that, that problem to solve, then they'll certainly rise to the challenge.
Sure.
Love that.
Anything you'd add, Mikaela?
Yeah, just co-sign on so many things you said, Rhonda, around, I think, the clarity of both expectations and decision-making, like, and the power and importance right now of all those little conversations outside. So as you think and talk about this as well, Alicia, I think about the ways in which often it's the like offline, you know, you're in a meeting, but then people chat at the end or the beginning, or all the ways that we establish that relationship around tough stuff that we're facing that doesn't exist now, because now you like turn the screen on and off, or you do that, you know. So I think the importance and necessity of those extras, so to your point about taking care of people, is just being in those, checking in, like one-on-one, do you know where people are? And even just as a resource to use, if people don't already do this, when you're having these conversations with groups of people, always starting off with some kind of check-in, always making sure you just know where people are as they enter into whatever's happening. So I think this is a really challenging and good question about taking care of people. And in a moment when things may be happening that have to serve a larger end, but that aren't good for each and every person or don't feel like it. And so how do you have those conversations like openly with people and address whatever the issues are? And I really appreciate Rhonda's point about kind of including them. It's presenting the challenge as opposed to presenting the answer and saying, how are we going to get to an answer on this? And then ultimately, we all know there may be times when you have to make decisions that are not going to be popular, or everyone doesn't like, if you're, depending on what role you play in that decision making. But how did you do it? How did you understand and make that that choice? And how did you include people in generating, to this point about creativity, like all of the possibilities and options? Because that's sometimes what we're limited by, is just the chance to see what the options are.
I would add too, this time period of being at home, but also dropping into each other's lives virtually, gets us thinking about we're not all at the same place or dealing with the same set of circumstances. So if we go back to those days when we would just show up to school every day at 7:25, it really didn't occur to us where our staff were coming from or the situations that they were leaving. They just came to work, taught, left, or whatever their role was at school. And so now in this environment, we really have to think carefully and more empathetically about what's happening in a person's home, and then factor that into have conversations. And so to your point about equity, that was something that we talked about offline. I think promoting equity is taking into consideration this outside life that is influencing how they are coming to work every day. And being in a physical space here, we could really discount that and not really care because we didn't see it. But in this environment, we're thinking much more about what's happening in people's homes, because that's how work is taking place from home.
Exactly.
So we have to be.
You can't separate it at all.
You cannot separate it, and you
Perfect.
have
Well, I know. I know we're running low on time too. I think these are really great, important things to be thinking of. There's a lot of great thoughts that came out of the chat too. So again, just a reminder to possibly consider saving the chat. Nicole also just shared a survey that we'd love for you to take to just give us some feedback, because we all want to get feedback, right? We were just talking about wanting to ask the people most impacted for their thoughts and such. And just a last quick reminder too, as we're continuing to think about equity, we can be redesigning some of the ways we've traditionally done things for equity. We can be not just trying to kind of fit this new, as many are referring to it as new normal, into what we've always done, but more thinking about this as an opportunity to change how we've always done things in an effort to actually be able to do things, make sure that our most vulnerable students, that all of our students and so forth are getting the best impact from this time and our future plans. So thank you so much to Mikaela and Rhonda and Lydia too for joining us today. Feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions that you might have. A lot of our conversation today is a great segue then into our last Talent Thursday for next week, where we're going to have some students coming in and talking to us about what they want teachers to know and what they want school leaders to know about what's important as they think about teacher and school leader talent issues and priorities for next school year. So I hope you'll be able to join us there also. So again, thanks so much for our panelists, and thanks to all of you who joined us today. This information will be available on the PCSB website in probably the next couple of hours. So thanks for being with us, and stay well and stay home, of course.